Well, welcome. Here we are tonight, PACA 2, and the topic today is a little bit different as far as not just distance running or training, but training and the differences, or are there differences to train men and women? And a lot of times we've heard, that I train a guy the same way I train a girl and so forth. But this last winter, I went around and was at several different high school clinics, and I heard Dr. Jason Karp, who's our guest tonight, talk about some of the physiology involved and brought out some points that I hadn't even thought of being a female, and yet he brought out some very good points. And so we've asked him to share with us tonight. And Jason, thanks so much for giving us your time. And basically, we'll turn it over to you here at the very beginning and then open it for conversation as we go. Does that sound like a deal?
Yeah, very
Okay,
good. Thank you for having me. This is great.
great. Well, Jason, why don't you go ahead? We're going to learn about how the women are different or aren't different in training methods.
Well, welcome everyone, and thanks again, Sue, for having me available to do this. I want to do a little bit of both. Ask Sue how I should do this, if you wanted a formal presentation or more, casual. And so we'll do kind of a mix of both. I have a lot of slides to share, but you can jump in at any time and ask me questions and stuff. But we don't have to go through every single slide like I would at a formal clinic. But I just wanted to share some information on this topic that I've been very interested in about for a very long time. And even from the time I was a kid, I used to ask myself, I wonder how female runners should train to optimize their performance. And so this is something that's been on my mind for quite a long time. It started back when my very first job was at an all-women's college, small school in New Jersey, Georgian Core College, and it was just a women's cross-country team. And it was then that I started really getting this interest in women's training and how women should train differently than men. And that has stayed with me all these years. Back when I was working in graduate school, I was actually taking physiology classes and learning more about reproductive physiology. And I was also coaching individuals privately. And so I just got really fascinated by this subject and how women's physiology can be applied to a training program. And so I've spoken about this a lot, and that's what gave Sue the idea for me to do this today. And I've written a couple of books on the subject, and I've done a lot of work in this area because I find it a very fascinating area, even though it may seem weird coming from a guy. This is a subject that I've been really fascinated in for quite a long time. So like I said, there's a lot that we can discuss about the physiology and the differences between men and women. If you get bored with this stuff, just jump in. We can get straight to the training because that's what I know that you guys probably want to know the most. That's what interests me the most. But it is interesting to give some background information to talk about, well, how are women different than men, both anatomically as well as physiologically? What are the major differences? And then how do you apply those differences to training? And one of those differences when it comes to anatomy, there's a couple of issues when it comes to anatomy, and it mostly has to do with women's hip width. If you notice, the best female runners in the country and in the world, they have very narrow hips. And there's a reason for that. One is an injury reason that this term, the Q angle, gets thrown around a lot, and so the Q angle is just a very small angle. If you can see in the picture here, if you were to drop a vertical line down through the patella and then a diagonal line that goes over the femur that meets the patella, there's a small little angle there. And it's referred to as the Q angle, Q for quadriceps, because those are the four muscles that are on top of the femur. And so in women who have wide hips, they're going to have a wider Q angle. And there's a couple of implications of that. One is an injury implication that, that patella, you can feel it yourself. If you can move that knee in that groove, your kneecap moves in that groove. And that side to side movement of the patella in that groove is called the tracking of the patella. Physical therapists use that term a lot, patellar tracking. And in a male who has very narrow hips, or in females who have very narrow hips, the Q angle is going to be very small because the femur almost comes down directly on top of the patella. And you can visualize, you can see how that would make for a more stable knee, that you won't get much patellar tracking because the bone on top, the femur, is coming down vertically right to meet the patella. But in women who have wider hips, you're going to have this more oblique angle, and that's going to cause some patellar tracking. And so that could potentially lead to more knee injuries in female runners compared to male runners. And so that's one issue, is the patellar tracking issue and the injury issue. The other is a performance issue. When the femur comes down more at an angle and you have a wider Q angle, when a woman touches down on the ground with her shoe, with her foot, some of the force that is applied to the ground is going to be lost in a horizontal direction. This takes you back to high school physics class, that a force is a vector. It has magnitude, how much force, and it has the direction at which that force is applied. Now, the vertical ground reaction force is the most important biomechanical issue with running, whether it's sprinting or distance running. You want to maximize the vertical ground reaction force. But in a woman who's got wider hips, who has a larger Q angle, some of the direction of that force, it's not all directed in the same plane of motion. It's not all directed vertically because you're striking the ground down at an angle. And so some of the force at push off is lost in a more horizontal direction. And so that's one anatomical reason why men can run faster than women. And that's also why you see very, very good female runners do not have wide hips. They do not have a large Q angle because of that force issue. You want all the force to be directed in one plane of motion vertically so that you're projected forward. And this, again, takes you back to high school physics class where we learned about Newton's 3 laws of motion. His third law of motion: for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So the larger the force that you apply to the ground, then the larger the subsequent ground reaction force, and the more you are projected forward with every step. And so a lot of training, to get it just away from this topic for a second, a lot of training is about how do you maximize that vertical ground reaction force, because that's what's going to increase your stride length and ultimately make the distance runner faster. So this is a little bit of an anatomical difference between men and women. And then some of the words I already put there, but I just described it. Sometimes I just, I know what I'm going to say, and then the words just magically appear on the slide. So then we get into one of the largest differences between men and women is the hormonal difference and the implications of those hormonal differences. So in women, the two major hormones of the menstrual cycle, estrogen and progesterone. And you can see here the functions of each. Estrogen, the biggest ramification of estrogen in women is what it does to women's metabolism, which differs from men. Estrogen shifts metabolism toward a greater reliance on fat. And by doing that, you conserve the limited store of carbohydrate that you have in the muscle. All humans, we have a limited store of glycogen. And when that glycogen gets very low, then the pace slows down, because then you have to rely on fat. But women shift metabolism toward a greater reliance on fat, which is one of the main reasons why women are very, very good at very long endurance activities. If you look at the results of ultra marathons, women are just as good as the men. I'm back
Jason,
in
the slides
2002,
are not
2000.
moving. I'm sorry.
What's not
Slides,
moving?
we're not seeing the slides move.
Oh, what slide do you see right now?
The first one with the woman in pink tights.
Oh, all this time you haven't seen it?
No, no, I was like, when you start
Oh, I
saying
don't know.
words,
I see it on my end. I don't know why it hasn't changed.
um,
How about, let me try it this way.
I
Let
think
me,
you shared the wrong screen.
oh,
I shared the wrong screen.
Oh, she did. She did.
Oh, how does she share the screen that,
how do I share it?
So look for the screen that has the slide that he's talking about.
let me try something on my end and see.
I mean, usually when they share the screen, I just give him co-hosting.
Yeah, the slides are to the left. They're all the way to the left, kind of in a margin.
Right.
They're just
Oh,
too
that's
small
not
to see.
good. Okay, I'm gonna try something else. Can you see it like this?
Yes,
Yes.
now we see it.
Oh, okay. So you didn't see that whole thing, did you?
No.
Oh, so all that time I was talking about that. Okay, well, you see, you heard me speak, and there's the picture. Sorry about that. I'll do it from the non-slide show. This just shows the slides like.
You can press the slideshow now and it should work, I think.
Yeah, the top,
Okay.
slideshow across the top there, so that the slide will be a little bit bigger.
Do you see it now?
We see hormones.
Yes.
Yes,
Okay, you see this.
we
You
just see
see the
hormones.
you see the hormones. Okay, perfect. That's what we were just talking about.
Okay.
Okay, very good. Sorry about that. So estrogen has a lot of huge implications for endurance performance, and like I said, the biggest one is how it changes metabolism. That it shifts metabolism toward a greater reliance on fat. It also decreases body temperature, which progesterone does the opposite. So there are times of the month when body temperature is highest because those are good conditions for conception. And so estrogen does some of the opposite things that progesterone does. And we'll see a graph here in a few minutes that shows the change of things during the entire cycle. But progesterone increases body temperature, estrogen reduces body temperature. And then estrogen also has been shown to increase muscle repair. So if you ever notice that women oftentimes can recover from local muscular work faster than a man can, and that's because estrogen is involved in satellite cells of muscles, which are responsible for muscle regeneration and repair. So there's a lot of fascinating things that estrogen does and how this has implications for training. Another thing that progesterone does is it increases breathing. And so there are times of the month where certain workouts may feel more difficult for women because runners often associate their perception of effort to how hard they breathe. When we breathe harder, we perceive that we're working harder, and that makes that we perceive the workout to be more difficult. So there's all these interesting things to keep in mind about estrogen and progesterone. And then these two other major hormones of the menstrual cycle, which I won't spend much time talking about today, but they're involved in the stimulation of ovulation and pregnancy. But we'll talk about the non-pregnancy issues here for purposes of training and everything. And then other differences between men and women. And again, we don't have to go through all of these slides to talk about all these differences because I want to get into more of the training and how to organize the training. But in terms of body weight and composition, women tend to subconsciously adjust their caloric intake to their caloric expenditure because women need to maintain a given percentage of body fat that is much higher than what a man needs. Essential fat for women is 12%, whereas essential fat for men is only 3%. But what happens when essential fat drops below 12% for women has huge ramifications for training and the entire menstrual cycle, because that's when menstrual dysfunction starts to occur. Women do need to maintain a significant amount of body fat for the reasons of conception and carrying a fetus. And so even this issue is fascinating to me that without a woman doing anything, before smartphones and smart cars, we had smart bodies. And when a woman's percentage body fat gets too low, the menstrual cycle starts to shut down on its own to protect the woman from getting pregnant under conditions that are not ripe for conception. So it's fascinating to me that a woman's body knows what to do to prevent pregnancy when the conditions are not good for pregnancy to occur. And a lot of that has to do with the percentage of body fat.
Should it still be on hormones?
No, now we're on a different, you're still not seeing it?
Now yeah, no.
Oh, all right. I'm going to do it this way. Can you see where it says
Now we
body weight
see,
and composition?
yes, now we do.
All right. I'm going to have to do this from just the manual from within the slides here rather than the slideshow itself. So the biggest issue with this is that women have to carry more weight, and so that's another thing that slows them down compared to men because weight don't contribute to energy. Body fat does not contribute to energy production while a woman runs, and so these are just again differences between men and women. And then another big issue is the cardiovascular difference. Women typically have smaller hearts because they have a smaller body, so all their internal organs are smaller compared to a man. And so their maximum cardiac output isn't as great as it is for a man. Women also have less hemoglobin in their blood, and hemoglobin is the protein that carries oxygen. So for all of these reasons, this is why women do not run faster than men do. But again, when you get into very long races, like well beyond the marathon, then metabolism takes over. And because of the shift of metabolism to the greater reliance on fat and less on carbohydrate, when the pace is not that fast, as it would be like in a 100-mile race, then women can do just as well as men, because then the emphasis is taken off the cardiovascular and it's placed more on metabolism and the use of carbohydrate and fat as fuels. And so again, what I just mentioned, the big issue about metabolism, that women use more fat, less carbohydrate, and therefore less protein. So the less protein issue is secondary to the fact that they're using less carbohydrate and more fat. Because when a male relies more on carbohydrate, once you become glycogen depleted, again, this doesn't happen in shorter races, but in much longer races, and much longer training runs, when the carbohydrate fuel tank gets low, then protein has to start kicking in some of the energy, because it's got to pick up the slack left by little carbohydrate left. So you start to rely more on fat, and then protein, which doesn't normally contribute much energy, it starts to kick in a little bit more just to pick up the slack left by the fact that there's little carbohydrate left. And then we get into things like when we talk about carbohydrate, we can also talk about glycogen replenishment, which is a big thing for marathon runners. That's why they're always consuming a lot of carbohydrates after a long run or after a marathon. And the whole issue of carb loading is different between men and women, because women don't increase muscle glycogen as much as men in response to carbohydrate loading, unless they also consume more total calories. So for women, it's also just a total calorie thing, not just the carbohydrate alone, whereas for men, it's just the carbohydrate issue alone, and then they can store more carbohydrate. And as I mentioned, the difference in metabolism between sexes gives the females advantage for very, very long endurance performance, mostly because of the changes in metabolism. And then some muscular differences. As we all know, women's muscles don't hypertrophy to the same extent as men because they don't have the testosterone. They have about 1/10 the amount of testosterone as men. And so because they can't hypertrophy the muscles as much as men, they also don't generate as much power. They don't store as much creatine phosphate as a man, just simply because they don't have as much muscle mass as men. And so that's a big reason why women aren't as powerful as men, and why women can't lift as much weight or sprint as fast as men, because their phosphagen system is less than that of a man, simply because they don't have as much muscle mass. And then we talked about estrogen and satellite cells and help repair of tissue. And then this issue with women with low estrogen may take longer to recover from strength workouts for that reason. All right, so now let's get more into the endurance performance. So there's two main reasons why women are very good at endurance. If you take a cross section of the population, most women fare better the longer the race. Now, of course, there are exceptions. You look at female sprinters, but they're self-selected for that because they have a genetic predisposition for that. But if you take a cross section of the population, women typically are very good at endurance. And the major reasons why is what we already talked about: estrogen, because of how it affects metabolism. And then also women typically have a greater proportion of slow twitch muscle fibers than men. Very fascinating research that's done muscle biopsies on many women and looking at the difference in fiber type proportions between men and women. That kind of research isn't really done in the US because it's hard to get that kind of research through human subjects committees. But over in Europe and in Scandinavia, they do a lot of muscle biopsy research. I guess they don't care about how invasive they are over there. They'll pull muscle fibers out of people's thighs all day long over there. But it's much harder to get that kind of research approved in this country because, it's invasive research to do these muscle biopsies. But it's fascinating research to look at the differences between men and women. And so here we go with the menstrual cycle. So again, we'll ignore the bottom graph, which is luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. And I'm assuming you can see my cursor as well when I move it around on the screen. And so here we have progesterone. So the menstrual cycle, as the women in attendance know, it's divided into two major stages. The first 2 weeks is follicular stage, and the second 2 weeks is luteal. And the easy way to remember that is just alphabetical. F comes before L. So the first 2 weeks, progesterone is pretty much non-existent. It's very low, and progesterone dominates the second half. The first half is dominated by estrogen. After the period, which is the first few days, then estrogen is on the rise and peaks right before ovulation in the middle of the cycle. And so this is a 28-day cycle. It's a textbook cycle, but it can fluctuate. Not every woman, of course, has a 28-day cycle. But the interesting things to know here are that the first phase, follicular phase, low progesterone and estrogen is on the rise the entire time. And it's really high the second week and peaks right at the end of the second week. And then the second phase is dominated by progesterone, but you also get a secondary peak in estrogen, which can, if it's high enough, can even overcome the peak in progesterone. So that's really a very simplified way of thinking about it. And that this tells you, if you understand the effects of estrogen, the effects of progesterone, and the effects of the period, then this tells you how to organize the training. And that's what we'll get into here. So here's just some notes about the same graph. The follicular phase, typically 14 days. But when a woman's cycle is more than 28 days, the reason it's more or less is because of the follicular phase. The luteal phase is always 14 days. That never changes. And so that gives you some idea of, well, how estrogen can change now. Because if you have a 21-day follicular phase, now you have a more beneficial effect of estrogen. Estrogen is the runner-friendly hormone. You want high estrogen for a female distance runner because it improves endurance performance, whereas progesterone can hurt endurance performance. So someone who has a longer follicular phase, you have basically a longer window in which to optimize the endurance training. And then the technical word for the period is menses, that lasts typically 3 to 5 days. And then all these notes are what I just said, that estrogen rises after the period for the first 2 weeks and peaks right before ovulation in the middle of the cycle. And so I'm going through this kind of stuff kind of quick just to get to the training. But one thing that's important to know before we get to the training is, well, I mean, this is textbook. This is what's supposed to occur. This up and down fluctuation of estrogen and progesterone is what's supposed to occur month after month after month. But what happens when it doesn't? Then we get into all these menstrual irregularities and what ramifications that has for female distance runners. You know, I've always said for probably 25 years now, I have said that, you know, all the injuries that occur in female distance runners in college, most of them can be avoided because a lot of them are tied to what's happening with the menstrual cycle. Because any condition that lowers estrogen, menstrual irregularities being one of them, postmenopause being another, and pre-puberty being another, a woman is at a much greater risk for bone fractures than she is during the normal menstruating years. And so if you have menstrual irregularities, that sets the bones up for being vulnerable to get a stress fracture. And so all these stress fractures you hear these high school kids getting and college kids, a lot of that can be avoided if the coach knows what's going on with their menstrual cycle, and then precautions can be taken to strengthen the bones and to alter the training so that you're not putting the girl at risk for a stress fracture. And so menstrual irregularities usually occur when there is a non-agreement between caloric intake and caloric expenditure. And that's why I think one of the slides I have coming up talks about the female athlete triad. And nowadays it's called relative energy deficiency in sport, the red S, to put the emphasis on the energy deficiency, because this whole series of events typically occurs not because of the training itself, but because the female is not consuming enough calories and she's becoming nutrient deficient. And then that sets the menstrual cycle up for becoming irregular. And then the extreme case, you lose the menstrual cycle altogether and become amenorrheic. And there is a very tight coupling between amenorrhea and stress fractures in female runners. And so if you want to avoid all of that, you got to try to keep a regular menstrual cycle. And so just some of the notes I put here. The first change is a shortening of the luteal phase, followed by cycles without ovulation, and then a cessation of menses, which is literally called amenorrhea. And that's defined clinically diagnosed as 0 to 3 periods per year. So anything less than 3 periods per year, a female is diagnosed with being amenorrheic. And so high training volumes, low body weight, and endurance sports are what increase the incidence of this. And then the emphasis is on inadequate caloric intake to match the caloric expenditure. That's what triggers this. So consuming more calories to compensate for the large caloric expenditure can prevent amenorrhea and menstrual irregularities. And so any disruption to menstrual cycle can cause the decrease in bone density. And so believe it or not, most people think if you ask them this question, what's the most significant factor in bone density? Most people think it's calcium or vitamin D, and those are important. But for women, estrogen is the single most important characteristic for bone health. And so, like I said, any condition that reduces estrogen then puts the bones in jeopardy of being fractured when they combine with the stress of running. Every time you run, you're putting 2 to 3 times your body weight on each leg at a time. And so that sets a female runner up for injuries. But that can be avoided if you just know what's going on. And then if you have menstrual irregularities, that doesn't mean a woman has to stop training. I mean, most elite runners are having menstrual irregularities because of the enormous volume of training they're doing, and maybe they're not eating enough. But you need to take precautions. Maybe you need a calcium and vitamin D supplement. Maybe you need to do some heavy strength training to improve bone density. And so there are other things that can be done in the face of menstrual irregularities to make sure that you still protect the bones and they don't get injured. Another thing is smart training. Maybe you don't ramp up the mileage that quickly, because that's something that will just add more stress and it can cause a stress fracture. So how you train, you got to add the volume and intensity very, very slowly during these conditions so that the body has time to adapt to that stress and that you don't cause a problem with the bones. So it's perfectly okay for females to train when they're losing their menstrual cycle, but you have to be aware of that so that you protect the bones so that they don't get injured. And then again, this just repeats a lot of what I said. The female athlete triad is this collection of 3 associated characteristics: menstrual irregularity, disordered eating, and low bone mineral density. And so any condition that lowers estrogen is what causes the issue to the bones. And so people think of osteoporosis as a disease that inflicts upon older population, but a 25-year-old or an 18-year-old can still have osteoporosis. It's not just for senior citizens that are post-menopause. It could be anybody if they have a low bone mineral density. And so again, go over this stuff pretty quick. Some more
Marcia's got a
physiological effects of the
question
menstrual
here.
cycle. Oh, go ahead, Sue.
Hey, Marcia, you want to unmute and ask?
Oh, Marcia had a question. Yeah.
Yeah. So back in the day when I was running, we just didn't even worry about stuff like that and we lived.
Yeah.
But obviously now we know better. Do you recommend that the female, particularly distance runners, be on hormonal birth control? Because I've had some parents ask me if we make them do that, and I say no, that's a personal decision
Right.
for
Yeah.
your daughter.
Yeah, that is a conversation that the athlete has to have with her gynecologist and her parents, because you can't just tell somebody, well, we're going to just force a regular menstrual cycle with birth control, because you can do that. I have one slide here on an oral contraceptive.
Okay.
And I've done that with adults that I've coached that they wanted to force a regular cycle, and you can do that because you're giving in the oral contraceptive, you're giving yourself estrogen. But that would have to be a conversation that you have together with the parents, the athlete, and the gynecologist to say, the way doctors always make a decision, it's always a cost to benefit ratio. What are the side effects to doing that? And are the side effects larger or lesser than the benefit? And if the side effect is large, like one side effect of the hormone replacement, the oral contraceptives, is weight gain, fat gain. And so that could also have psychological repercussions for a female athlete. And so you have to look at the entirety of the athlete's situation and then make a smart decision together with the gynecologist. Is do the side effects, do the negative aspects of doing it outweigh the benefit, or are they lesser than the benefit? If a woman is susceptible to getting bone fractures and she's already had a history of stress fractures, then maybe it is a good idea to take oral contraceptives so that you protect the bones. But it's impossible to give you an answer to that because you have to look at all of the factors involved and then weigh the pros and the cons to see if it's a good decision or not.
Thank you.
But that's an excellent question. These are the questions that come up for coaches, and these are the conversations that have to be had. But the biggest thing is education with the athletes so that they know, what's going on, and the coaches know what's going on, and to openly discuss this stuff. And it can be a little bit difficult for male coaches to have these conversations with the female athletes. But if you set it up from a position of education and that I, as the male coach, I'm trying to help you be the very best runner you can be. We're on the same page. We both want the same thing. We want you to be the fastest you can be. Then it makes it easier to have that conversation than if a coach just comes across as being invasive into the girl's life. And so if you set the standards early on that your job and I'm talking to the male coaches here, I guess, that your job as the male coach is to set that girl up for as much success as possible. And this is a key piece to that. Just like you would with the males and their physiology and understanding the effects of testosterone. It's the same thing with the females and their physiology, that this is all done for the purpose of making the athlete as fast and as successful as possible. And everybody wants that, right? The coach wants that, the athlete wants that, the parents want that, everybody wants that.
Jason, you've got another question or comment
Oh,
here.
yeah.
David, you want to unmute?
Oh yeah, I was just saying that I had two different athletes in my event group that I had to deal with that had one had their menstrual cycle every 2 weeks,
Ooh,
and they didn't tell me that until halfway through the school year, and was like, Coach, I think there's something going on with me, and I said, what's going on? And they're like, well, I don't know, I feel like I'm having my period too often. I said, well, what's too often? They're like, well, it's like every other week right now. I said, well, that sounds irregular to me. And I could tell just there was just a sudden change in their mood and was tired all the time and kind of overly aggressive with their teammates. And that's not normally how that person was.
Mm.
And so thankfully there was a coach from another sport that we just have a great relationship, and it's a female coach, and we're able to just kind of sit down because we didn't have a female athletic trainer. We were able to sit down with the young lady and realize that it was because, to Jason's point, it was a change in their birth control,
Mm.
and so it was causing this huge hormonal change. And then the other young lady, she had changed her birth control, and she put on, it was like 20 pounds in 1 month.
Ooh.
And so they got those things changed. And the one young lady that put on all the weight, literally just in about a 2 to 3 week period, they were able to get back into, healthily, in a healthy way, losing that weight back. But it was really tough because we're in the middle of the season and all this is happening. And they're trying to realize, like, why am I not running as well as I'm supposed to? And
Right. Yeah.
so, well, so it was difficult at the time being a male coach and having to broach those subjects. But to your point, just coming from the standpoint of like, hey, we're just all trying to get you to run fast, and they were okay with, talking about an uncomfortable subject.
Right. Yeah. It's all about making them feel comfortable and having the conversations with everybody involved. The gynecologist, the parents, the athlete, the coach. When everyone gets involved, then the athlete feels like, yeah, everyone's got my best interest here. I'm not just dealing with this by myself. I've got a whole network of people here who are trying to help me be the best I can be. And then when they feel comfortable like that, it's much easier to discuss these things openly.
Yep.
Yeah. Is there anything else that I don't see everybody on the side here, so I don't know if I can't see people raising their hands or anything. So just feel free to
Let's,
chime in.
Christy, you want to go ahead?
Don't you think, Jason, like as maybe it's time that we take the stigma off of it? And if we can, I think
Yeah.
this was a wonderful topic and a wonderful call, and I really appreciate you guys doing it because I think that if we make it not an uncomfortable subject, then
Right.
I think it starts with us as coaches being able to, and I'm saying this as a female, but as a male coach, to be able to have that conversation to where it's not awkward anymore. And
Right.
then,
Oh yeah, yeah. Yeah, I
so
completely agree. I mean, it's fascinating to me. I mean, there's a lot of things about this topic that fascinate me. And one of those things is I don't understand why this has always been such I mean, you got half the population of the world that goes through this every month. I mean, I don't understand why the secretiveness and why people are uncomfortable talking about. I've never understood why this has this stigma to begin with when it's not like only a select group of people deal with this every day. It's half the world's population deals with this every single day and every single month. And so I've never understood why this is such a difficult topic to discuss because it should be completely open since everyone is dealing with it anyway. Yeah, I've never understood why the stigma associated with all of this.
I think it's a lot more open discussion now than it used to
Yeah,
be,
sure. Yeah, it's getting
because
better. Yeah.
yeah, when I first started coaching, it was like the female would come to me and want me to go tell the male coach.
Mm,
It's like, or she want me to be there when she was discussing it. And nowadays, it just seems like it's a common discussion. It's not so much, the hush hush, like you said.
right. It's unfortunate it's taken this long to get to this
Right.
point. But yeah, I guess it's good that that people feel comfortable talking about it and because it's important. I mean, one thing about coaching, it's not just a distance running coach. There's so much health going on too. You're not just training an athlete, you're also dealing with health.
Mhm.
And so, it's all the more reason why this needs to be discussed. I mean, in a minute, we're going to talk about anemia and there's a lot of things that go on especially with female distance runners that cross over into health, not just distance running performance. And so it's very important to discuss all these things because this is something that affects a woman's health, not just her performance. Well, if anyone, I mean, again, just chime in if anybody has any questions because I don't see everybody. You're kind of on the right side of my screen, but I only see like three people and myself. I don't even like to look at myself when I'm talking.
Jason, this is Al Schmidt.
Oh, hi, Al.
Jason and I know each other for a long time.
Yeah,
Barbara Drinkwater did
yeah,
a level 3 for us a long time ago that her work on this subject with uh, older women, and she felt like carbohydrates were the reason was very essential once the menstrual cycle stopped and just keep bone health.
mm-hmm,
And so and then there's Mike Stone, who's
mm-hmm,
married to Meg Ritchie's probably one of the uh biggest experts in hormonal their hormone like you're talking about. And but he also brings in the fact that training raises women's testosterone and
does.
recovery and recovering or
Mm-hmm,
resting
mm-hmm,
lowers testosterone. So to peak a female, you have to make sure that you keep the testosterone up during the peaking period so that they may train harder closer to the race than male do. Because
yeah,
if a male rests, testosterone goes up. And so you'll have, if you turn a male loose when they're rested, he may tear muscle fibers too close to the race if you don't control his pace. But females, you may have to have a hard, intense anaerobic session 4 days prior to a state meet or an NCAA championship or a big race. You know, not a lot of volume, but intensity has to be up to keep the testosterone up. So you've gotta between estrogen and testosterone, you've got a fight going on there too. So
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah. Yeah. Believe it or not, what it's I'll call myself out a little bit, but believe it or not, one of my books is about the effects of exercise on sex. And I go into a lot, I talk a lot about the effects of exercise on testosterone and the differences between men and women. And yeah, it's a fascinating subject. But women, the good thing about that too is with the high intensity, women do typically recover faster than men. So it may not be as big of a risk to have a woman do higher intensity closer to the race because they may not need as much recovery in the days following that workout compared to a man. So there's lots of interesting.
Larry Judge, when he was at Florida and we had the SEC meet here at Mississippi State, he needed the weight room open 4 hours before the event so
Oh,
that
wow.
they could lift
Hmm.
and raise their testosterone before the throws.
Yeah, that's
4 hours.
interesting.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
he drove our strength coach crazy, but
Lauren Seagrave did that when he was coaching at LSU also. That was one of the first women's coach, I mean, that I've heard of with the women's teams. And that's what we're saying is the theories are that women can lift heavier closer to the peak meet, if you will,
Hmm.
than
and
men.
and Jason, the one thing that I ran into with Tiffany is I didn't let her miss more than one cycle at a time, and I had her specifically keep her weight in a 4 to 3 pound. If she got too light, I'd get on her. I always wanted to know if she got below 127
Mm.
or higher than 130. We kept in that range, and um, but it helped with her drastically. But the one mistake we made, she missed a second one, so she went to her gynecologist, who is not a running
Mm.
expert. And you know how much training increases
Yeah.
blood volume.
Yeah.
And she put a patch on her.
Oh.
And so estrogen patch, and it took us 4 months to get her back from winning her first national
Oh,
championship
wow.
at 406, breaking Faber's record, to being able to run faster than 445 in the mile
Oh,
indoor. And
wow.
thank God, Dr. Adams and all the physiologists and the Olympic people were helping me. And they just said, you can't, there's nothing you can do
Mm.
except wait. And fortunately, before the SEC and nationals, she ended up winning her second national championship. But she went from 445 down to 429.
Mm.
So fortunately, and won a second.
Yeah.
Took all
Yeah.
indoors to suffer.
And so how long was that period of time?
Oof. It was from December 1st till the SEC meet was right at the end of February. So she ran 432 at the SEC meet finally and broke through. So, but we had to be patient. We
Yeah.
continued the same workouts. It's just they weren't as fast as they were when the estrogen wasn't, the patch had
Mm.
done the damage, So you got to make sure that your gynecologists are
Yeah. That they work with
understanding.
athletes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's important that they have experience with the the athletes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if, for those of you who work at universities that have a team physician, I don't know how hands-on the team physician is in subjects like this and the counseling that they may give to athletes. I don't know how involved they are. I mean, maybe Al could speak to
It's
that.
gotten bad, Jason, that coaches have a hard time. You have to know the athlete really well so that you don't have to go through, and I know the doctors really well, but I could go through the doctors and I could go through the trainers, but there's some SEC schools that will not allow a coach to talk to them about any of this.
Oh,
Yeah,
oh,
it's
wow.
gotten very, I know a coach lost her job because she was asking about weight and periods and
Yeah.
things like that. So it does definitely depend on the school. And just the whole, like guys that are coaching that are here, are you having trouble with this or are you able to talk to the athletes? Some of you guys that are currently coaching college, because I know some of you do.
I don't know if Tony did, but he and I were coaching about the same time. And we didn't have a problem because we were so close to the athlete and close to the doctors and trainers a little bit more. But now they're putting more and more roadblocks up.
Right.
I
Definitely.
agree with Al and Jason. It's totally about the relationship that you have with the athlete. One
Mhm.
of my superstars, like I could just tell her, I was like, I could just flat out ask her what she ate today, and she's just like, I know I'm trying, but she was, not running super high mileage, but high intensity, and I just had to stay on her. I was like, you need to pack extra food in your bag during the day and stuff like that. And she was receptive to it because she knew she didn't want to get too light or mess herself up. But I couldn't do that with some people because then they think I was monitoring them too closely or whatever. I would rather have somebody carrying a few extra pounds than send them the other way.
Right.
I had a girl come
Mhm.
to me from another program who became so disordered eating that she ended up in a hospital for a cardiac condition
Mm.
for several months and then ended up at an eating disorder clinic. And then we thought we were, she came back super honest with me about the process. You started off with walking and what have you. And we eventually got her back to running. But when she got back to running full time, the old habits reverted. And we realized it was best for her mental and physical health that she just step away. And
Wow.
no, she turned into a gym rat. She's married, she's happy, and she's healthy, and that's all I care about. That is way more
Yeah.
important than running it.
Yeah.
But you got to be real careful because she said the coach she had at her other school made a comment, and this is a person that's already very slender, said, hey, if you drop a few pounds, you'll run faster.
Yeah.
And she
That's the,
did, but it just became like
yeah.
so, and I just think, and it's not a scientific thing, but I think people individuals have a balance point for themselves.
Yes.
And I think if you go to enforce that, and I found that out when I was an athlete, I'm tall, so I weighed more than other people. But I said, oh, if I'm lighter, I'm going to run faster. And I dropped some weight and I fell apart. Luckily, nothing serious. And I'm glad I caught myself. But not everybody does.
Yeah.
And
I think
Yeah.
I ran
this
in the
is
era where you can't be too light.
And that's where this whole conversation gets tricky because there is a lot of truth to if you want to be a better distance runner for men or for women, the lighter you weigh when it's still healthy, you can't cross the line, but you want to weigh as little as possible and still be healthy. And so that's where it gets tricky because on one hand, there is truth to that, that if you lose weight, yeah, I mean, that's your VO2 max is going to increase if you lose weight because it's mLs per kg per minute. So you reduce the kg, the VO2 max goes up. And so there is truth to that. But then that gets into the slippery slope. And so you got to be really careful because you got to make sure that the girl doesn't cross over the line and gets into problems with the menstrual cycle and the psychological issues associated with weight. And so that's where it becomes that's probably the one of the most difficult parts of this whole thing is that you do have to weigh as little as possible and still be healthy. if you want to run as fast as you possibly can, but you have to do it in a safe way. You have to still be healthy, try to maintain the menstrual cycle activity, and making sure that you still get all the nutrients. You can't be deficient. So you got to lose weight without losing nutrition. So you still have to make sure that you're getting adequate nutrition for all these physiological mechanisms to still not be hurt. And so that's where it becomes the trickiest conversation with people because, yeah, I mean, there is a lot of truth to that, that if a woman loses weight, 9 times out of 10, she is going to run faster. And that's what they want. But it has to be done in a very safe, non-extreme way with no pressure placed on the girl. And, again, it all comes down to education and understanding the physiology of the sport and what's driving the bus of performance and what helps a woman to become the best she can be.
Jason, that's why and Tony can chime in. I loved recruiting 1,500-meter people more than on the female side because I could concentrate on more intensity than I do, even at the threshold level at the higher end, and keep their volume down. Tiffany, for example, never really ran much more than cross country more than 50 miles a week, but she ran fast. And Margaret Gross, who won the trials in 88, she never ran more than 80 miles a week in the marathon and was the third fastest marathoner of all time at that particular time. And I know Tony did phenomenally with his middle distance, 800 meters and up. So that's why I liked recruiting them and not having to train. And they run great 6Ks and 5Ks off of intensity. Because if you jack the volume up, then you have to worry about what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Let me jump in here a little bit. There may be a little bit of a departure here, but my last few years, I had two extreme experiences with the team doctor. One team doctor ran track and field at Wisconsin, and he was phenomenal, fabulous. He was so good that he's now a team doctor for the Los Angeles Rams. Any question that I had with him, we spoke on the same level. He knew exactly what we're talking about. He was replaced by another doctor that had no clue whatsoever. I actually got reprimanded and taken to the task because we were recommending that our females take iron. And that doctor said, "What do you think you are? Are you a doctor? You prescribing these types?" And we went through a long battle trying to get through that. And so I tippy-toe around team physicians until you figure out, do they have an understanding and a wisdom where they can help you as opposed to becoming roadblocks in your performances.
Right.
It was really tough. Unfortunately, at that time, my female assistant really, she was pulling her hair out with this doctor because she kept interfering with body weight and so on and so forth. And I don't know what her issue was, but it certainly wasn't performance after having the previous physician that was so successful.
And Jason, I know that volume helps you increase mitochondrial levels in the slow twitch and fast twitch 2A, which is necessary to run even 1,500 meters.
Exactly.
And VO2 max, people have to understand, as you know, because you've talked about it 1,000 times and written about it. VO2 max is cardiac output plus AVO2 difference. So that's the problem that you run into when it comes to what you're talking about, having to do enough aerobic work to increase mitochondrial beds. I lost you. Did you go away, Jason? Where'd you go?
No, he's here.
No, I'm here.
Christy
I'm right
has a
here.
comment
Oh, there
too.
you are.
I'm still here.
Yeah, Christy'd like to share.
So
Yeah. Uh,
I have the question or comment that we as coaches, can we not start talking and discussing and using the language of nutrition for performance versus weight loss? Because
yeah.
there's obviously so many problems on the women's and the men's side with eating disorders or disordered eating. So do you think that that would help if the
Yeah.
terminology changed to where we
Yeah.
talk about
Yeah. Very
nutrition
much. Yeah.
performance?
It should always be on the performance, not on the body weight, because
Yeah.
the body weight will become what it's supposed to become if you're focused on the performance. So yeah, you should never focus on the body weight, always focus on the performance. So yes, I agree 1,000%. It's always about the goal is to try to make the athlete perform at the highest level and help them achieve their goals. And so it's the conversation should always be centered on the performance, not on the body weight. The body weight is something secondary that will come along for the ride if you focus on the performance. And that's true for every sport, not just for endurance athletes. Endurance athletes
And,
typically have they're in a unique situation compared to other sports, but yeah, it's true for every sport. They're always focused on the performance.
and Sue and Jason and when you talk about nutrition, now most of the SEC schools have a nutritionist that won't let you talk to them about nutrition. So
Yeah. So this is
it's getting so
yeah, because this is where it gets tricky because you have to have several people working together, right? Because the coach is not a doctor, the coach is not an RD. So you have to bring in these other people because, yeah, you can get into scope of practice. If you have a coach who starts talking about female health and starts talking about anemia, we'll get to that slide in a second if we get to it, but I'll make sure we get to it because it's important. But if you have a coach starting to talk about this stuff, then you start getting into scope of practice issues, and that's not good. And so you have to make sure that you bring in all these other people from the athletic department who have that background, who have, the RD, the team physician, because the conversation has to involve everybody. I
But
mean, I've always said my entire career, and I'll say it the rest of my career, you wouldn't take legal advice from someone who didn't go to law school. So coaches have to be careful that they're not giving advice, that they're not giving advice that they're not equipped to give. Because then, yeah, other people are going to come down on you and say, no, no, you can't talk about that because that's not your background. And so, what that doctor said to Tony, I mean, the doctor is right. The doctor, the coach is not the doctor. And so that's stepping over a line that coaches have to be careful they don't step over. You got to bring in all these other professionals to have the conversation because you're dealing with health. And the coach is not a medical professional or a health professional. But that's the unique situation with endurance athletes compared to the tennis team. You're dealing with health every single day. Coaches deal with injuries, you're dealing with the menstrual cycle, you're dealing with reproductive health. And so it gets to be a tricky situation because it's hard to be a coach and not address health concerns with female athletes because they're always going to be present. It's part of the job. And so it's important to bring in all these other professionals so that you don't end up in a scope of practice situation.
do you think like that it could be, it's just general language of basic things,
Yeah,
not trying to
yeah,
dip into all that because I think people are afraid to say anything and then it becomes the taboo
sure.
thing, which then I think it escalates the problem.
Yeah. So yeah, that's another reason why to focus on performance because that's the coach's job, right? Your
Right.
main job is to improve athlete performance. So if you always focus on performance, well, that's not scope of practice. That's what you're there to do. That's why you got hired. Your main goal is to train the athletes. That's the main responsibility of the coach is to train the athletes.
and recovery is important
Yeah,
for
right. Right.
if you do a long run, carbohydrates should be the meal.
Right.
If you do speed, protein should be
Right.
the the meal of the day. And so, that, as you just said, that may be one way to talk about it. To tell them, you went on a long run today, eat some spaghetti or carbohydrate dinner, versus when they do something very fast, like 6 times 400 or 8 times 400 at 1,500 meter speed or faster, then you need to eat protein to repair fiber damage, muscle fiber damage. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
recovery is a huge part of the training process.
Oh, yeah.
that's right. It's
definitely.
part
Yeah.
of the training process is recovery, and that's the one thing you can tell a doctor. You can, an anemia, like Tony said, down here in the South, so you sweat out, and then probably in California, you sweat out red blood cells and iron. And I mean, you sweat out iron, so you do lose sweat. We had a study done at Florida State when I was there with Dr. Clement up in Canada, which Jason, you heard of him, and
Mhm.
our physiologist, and we found out that the better the athlete is, the less sweat they lost. I mean, the less iron they lost. But there's certain athletes that lose a lot of iron when they sweat.
Yeah. And the main, that's why, since we're talking about, I just put up the slide here, the main way that women lose the iron is through the menstruation, especially if they bleed a lot every month. And of course, they're losing red blood cells and they're losing hemoglobin. And so I assume everybody in here knows all this already, but I'll just say, just to be brief, that why iron is so important is because it's the heme of hemoglobin. Heme refers to iron. So iron is a very important component of hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is what transports oxygen in the blood. And so that's why if a girl is low in iron, that's why it hurts her, because it reduces the ability to transport oxygen in the blood. And so that's why, just as a little background, that's why iron is so important. And the main way that women will lose iron is, well, there's a few ways you can lose it, as Al just brought up. I mean, what's also called foot strike hemolysis. Hemolysis, the
Right.
breaking of red blood cells. If you run a lot, the constant pounding on the pavement. But that's the minor way. The major way a woman will lose iron is if she bleeds a lot during menstruation every month. And so this is a big issue among female runners at all ages. I've coached a lot of women of all different ages over the years, and this comes up over and over and over again. And so, the best way is to try to prevent it from happening, to try to prevent anemia, because once a girl becomes anemic, it takes a while for the iron stores to get to backed up to normal. And so, the best way is to try to prevent it from happening. And so we get iron, of course, from lean red meat and other sources, green leafy vegetables, dark green leafy vegetables, and some other food sources. So you have to try to make sure that, number one, the girl's diet is adequate enough that she's getting enough iron in the diet. And then if she is, another reason why you can become anemic is because due to absorption issues. So there's dietary issues and there's absorption issues. And so the diagnostic test for this is looking at ferritin. And it's a wide range, as you see here. It's a very, very wide range. But clinically diagnosed as anemia for women is a ferritin level of under 30. If someone is under 30, I mean, she's going to feel it. She'll feel sluggish during workouts. She may have trouble hitting the times that you give her as the coach to hit for the different reps, and she won't feel that normal, fast, easygoing feeling. I mean, I've actually had low iron in the past, and you can feel it. It's so mild. If you have mild anemia, sometimes you can get out of anemic situation just from the diet alone and just keep eating diet-rich foods. But if it's an absorption issue, then you have to usually go on a supplement or try to do something to increase absorption. And so I don't know if you can see the total screen here, but because of this panel that's on the bottom of my screen, I don't know if you see the exact same thing. But severe anemia, the two most effective forms of elemental iron, and you can see this, it'll say it on the back of the bottle, it's either ferrous bisglycinate or ferrous sulfate. So if you do have an athlete who needs to go on an iron supplement, those are the two most effective elemental iron sources. And there's a lot of companies that sell this. I mean, you can go to CVS and it's over the counter. None of this is prescribed by a doctor. You know, you get this over the counter and you can go online and buy them, or you can get the liquid. The liquid form has been shown to be more effective than a pill, but a lot of people don't tolerate the liquid form as well. They get upset stomach from that. So then you just go on a pill form of it. But it takes months. So once someone becomes anemic, to get ferritin back up to normal values, it takes months of taking the iron supplement every single day. So, you know, that could ruin the athlete's season because the season may only be 3 or 4 months long. And so you got to try the best you can to prevent it from happening in the first place. So, like at the start of a school year, it's a real, or even over the summer before they come to school, if every single one of the female athletes can just get a simple blood test to check ferritin, it's a very good idea because then you can prevent something from happening. Because once it happens, it may already be too late for that athlete, at least for that season. But this is a very common problem in female athletes at all different ages. That if you lose a lot of iron every month in the blood with heavy menstruation, then you can become anemic.
Jason,
You had mentioned about training and stuff, because I want to respect everybody's time
Yeah,
and like
yeah,
about
I
15
want to make
minutes.
sure we get to that. The other thing
Yeah.
with this too is for any of you who coach athletes at altitude, it's also, you know, altitude can increase the chances of becoming anemic because obviously you need more oxygen transport at altitude. And so it's a good idea for women to take an iron supplement if they're training at altitude. But, you know, I could spend a whole hour talking about altitude training and its effects on this, but, you know, I know we don't have the time for that. So I want to move on. So one thing about training for a female compared to a male is that while a man's training program can be sort of static because there's not a whole lot of things other than scheduling things that can get in the way, a woman's training program needs to be more flexible. It needs to be more open to change, moving workouts here and there based on how the athlete feels. And so it has to be more fluid than a man's program because of the constant fluctuation of estrogen and progesterone and how that makes a woman feel at different times of the month, and also in cases in which the menstrual cycle is lost or it becomes irregular. And so there just needs to be more flexibility in a woman's training program compared to a man. And then the biggest thing, I mean, I want to get to some things important here. Um, Yeah, well, you can just graze over this. The biggest thing, because this can be a complex issue, the biggest thing is understanding that estrogen typically improves endurance performance and progesterone hurts it. So times of the month when estrogen is high, namely week 2 of the menstrual cycle, as you're coming into ovulation, the whole week 2, that is the best time for women to push the endurance work. So increase the mileage, do the threshold training, the long tempo runs. That's when women typically do the best for endurance. For anaerobic, for the speed work, it's not as important. The research has shown that there's no difference from one phase of the menstrual cycle to the other in terms of strength performance or anaerobic power performance. All the ramifications of the menstrual cycle are specific to endurance performance because of the effects of estrogen and progesterone, how it affects endurance. So times of the month when estrogen is high, push the endurance. Times of the month when progesterone is high is a better time to back off. And I have an interesting looking graphs here that I've made up. Here would be an example. So this is a typical 28-day, 4-week menstrual cycle where the period happens in days 1 to 5, and that too is variable. Some women have it for just 2 or 3 days. Some women have it for closer to a week. Again, there's a lot of variation in this from woman to woman, but times of the month. So this time right here, when estrogen is on the rise, is the best time to push the endurance work. Whereas during coming into the period at the very end of the cycle, when progesterone and estrogen both drop, then the woman typically feel, that's when she would get the premenstrual cramps and all of that. That's a better time to back off and try not to push the hard workouts during the time of the month when it is not set up for that. And so if you can organize the training around this cyclical variation of estrogen and progesterone, that is the best way to do it. However, when you have a team situation, it gets complicated because you can't be putting every athlete on a different training plan. And so you have to kind of conform to the average. But there's some funny stories of women who train together. They start syncing up their cycles together, and then that makes it simpler for the coach because then you can have everyone do the same training and everyone's having the same cycle. That's the ideal situation when you're training a team. But there's a lot of ways that you can plan this out. So like here, increase training volume to coincide with the follicular phase, especially week 2, when estrogen is high, and refrain from increasing or slightly reduce the training mileage during the period and when estrogen is low. Avoid challenging workouts during the period, especially if the athlete has a lot of symptoms, if they get a lot of cramping and a lot of pain. Obviously, it's going to be much harder to get through workouts at that time. And then, some other comments, don't be a slave to a 7-day week, understanding that the women's training program has to be more open to change and fluidity. But then, in one of my books, I talk about the different models of periodization, and one of them is block periodization. The menstrual cycle really is a great chance to practice block periodization because you can put a lot of stress, a lot of training stress during the time of the month when estrogen is on the rise. So, for example, here is an example of block periodization. You can put maybe 2 to 3 hard workouts during week 2, and then the other 3 workouts, the other 3 weeks of the cycle, you could just have one workout, one maintenance workout, and then you really hammer the athlete with a lot of tough endurance workouts during week 2 when she's set up to thrive off of that kind of training. And so it's a great chance to really organize the training where you can match up the training weeks with the menstrual cycle weeks, whereas the hard week would be week 2 and weeks 2, 3, weeks 3, 4, and 1 of the menstrual cycle becomes your new training week. So here's an example. If the runner has a 28-day cycle and period occurs from days 1 to 5, Monday through Friday, you can plan a hard workout toward the end of the week to avoid the period. And if planning 2 workouts that week, again, you could just try to manipulate things so you avoid the period, because post-period, then estrogen is on the rise the whole time. And so you can really hammer the athlete with tough workouts during that time, understanding that that's the time of the month that she's likely to feel the best. Now, having said that, there is a lot of variability. Not all women are going to feel the exact same way at the same week as every other woman. And so there has to be a lot more individuality in the training, and encourage your athletes to keep a training log so that they write down, all right, I did these kinds of workouts this week, and this is how I felt. I did those kinds of workouts that week, and that's how I felt. And then you can match up the feeling of training with the objective workouts, and then you can come to a really individualized training plan for each athlete, pushing the hard work when the girl feels great, and backing off when she doesn't feel great and when she has menstrual symptoms and all that other stuff. So I know I'm going over this kind of quick because I want to make sure I get it in. But the block periodization is a great way to congregate more of the stress in a short period of time and then back off from that stress to recover during the other weeks of the cycle. And then racing, that kind of also matches the training that at a time that the girl is the best chance to run well is when estrogen is on the rise. And again, all of this stuff is more important for longer endurance performance than shorter. So like for an 800-meter runner or a miler, 1,500-meter runner, they won't be as affected because there's also the huge anaerobic component, and that does not seem to be affected by different phases of the menstrual cycle. It's only the endurance. So when you get into the longer races, especially marathon, this becomes even more paramount. It's trying to line up the marathon, at the height of week 2 of the menstrual cycle. That would be like the most ideal time to do it. So again, I didn't want to go through every single slide to take up too much time because I know people have questions, but if anyone has any
Christy,
questions.
if you've got questions, please raise your little hand, that virtual hand, and start asking them.
That would help. And then again, not to promote my book, I'm always I may as well be honest. I'm always promoting my books because I want people to read them. So if you are interested in diving deeper into this topic, two of my books are on this subject: Running for Women, which talks about all the different life periods of a woman, premenopause, and then postmenopause, as well as during the menopausal years. I mean, during the menstrual years, and then Like a Woman really focuses all just on the menstrual cycle and all the issues related to the menstrual cycle and how to train. And there's a training program in that book as well. And so I urge you to read more up on this and even share it with your athletes. I mean, I think it's empowering when, it's one thing for the coach to dictate, and I believe this even without this subject, even with men. It's one thing for the coach to dictate to the athlete what you're going to do today and tomorrow and the next day. It's a whole other thing to teach the athletes about training and empower them so that they take ownership of their own training and they understand why you're asking them to do what you're asking them to do on Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday. When they are educated and they understand, I mean, that opens up a whole new door for both you and the athlete because now they really understand, and that understanding becomes a governor. Like one of the big mistakes runners make, whether it's male or female, is running too fast on easy days. But if you deeply understand what it is you're trying to accomplish with that run or that workout, that acts as a governor. And then you don't run too fast on your easy day because you understand what it is you're trying to accomplish. And so throughout my career, that's always what I've tried to impress upon coaches is that, always teach your athletes, coaches are teachers, teach your athletes how to train effectively and why you're telling them to do things in a specific way to get a specific result, because that empowers the athlete and then they deeply understand what it is that they're trying to do every day when they come to practice.
Okay, I'm going to jump in. Christy and Michael have comments. So, Christy, you're up.
I actually was asking questions, which then he actually answered. So
Okay, so
so
you're
I'm good. I'm
set?
good.
Okay, Michael, what's your question, please?
Yes. So when discussing in a team setting, you hit it briefly. What would be your thoughts on, let's say you have a team of 16 distance runners on the women's side, but like they are not synced up as far as when their cycles are. Would you even suggest breaking up into different groups as far as workout partners, or like how
Yeah.
would you go about trying to get
Yeah,
success at that?
based on how much flexibility you have with the team, because obviously you want to try to individualize things as much as possible in a team situation. So given how much flexibility you have with breaking people up into different groups, then yeah, I would always recommend that. Like maybe this group does the VO2 max workout on this day on Tuesday, and maybe the other group does it on the next day, Wednesday, while the other group is going on an easy run. If you can do that and still keep the team dynamic and all the benefits of the team together, then I would always recommend that. You always have to try to be creative and individualize the training as much as possible in the team situation, and I mean, that gets also into other, recruiting issues. Like when you're recruiting at a college, I mean, ideally, you'd want to recruit as many people who are physiologically the same as you can, because otherwise it's going to be a mess to try to train everybody, and no one's going to get maybe two people will get the correct training stimulus, and everybody else goes along for the ride. And that's why that was one fascinating thing. I lived in Kenya for a little bit and I was coaching a group there. I put a group together, and that's one interesting thing about they all train the same way, but they can get away with that because all the Kenyan runners come from one common ancestor. They're all part of the Kalenjin tribe. They all come from the same tribe in Kenya. So physiologically, they're so similar that all the cookies in the jar can benefit from the same training plan. Whereas in America, all the cookies in the jar are very different. We all come from different heritages and different ancestries. And it's very difficult to coach a group like that because what works for one person is not going to necessarily work for another person in that same group. And so you have to try to individualize the training as much as possible. So yeah, to directly answer your question, given how much flexibility you have, I would always recommend trying to do what you suggested is divide the team into groups so they still feel like they're trained together. They still have the team dynamic, which is all powerful, but also try to individualize the training by doing it that way, by breaking them up into individual groups. So maybe they don't all do the same workout on the exact same day of the week.
I mean, this stuff is so interesting to me because traditionally, and maybe just the settings I've been in, but I've been with high level distance teams too, and everybody trained the same way. And
Yeah.
so the sprinters were different trained, the jumpers were different, but distance, it seemed like they all trained the same type of workout. And so that's
Yeah, I
what's
mean, it's,
interesting with all of this. Michael,
yeah,
you
that's
got
what's
more?
done, all over the country because it's just the logistics of having a team. And
Yeah.
but what are the chances that the same training plan is going to work equally well? I mean, that never happens, I mean, so you coach to the middle and the extremes,
Right.
but you can get around that too with recruiting. You look for the same physiological strengths. You got to skew the training to an athlete's strengths. And so when you're recruiting as a college coach, don't just recruit who's fast. You got to try to homogenize your team and look for the physiological strengths and try to match up the physiological strengths of all the runners so that one training program then will equally affect everybody in the same way.
Michael, do you have
Everyone just
another?
goes for who's fast. Oh, I want that kid. He's fast. I want that girl. She's fast. Well,
You're going to
then you
recruit
keep
by
relying on
period
their
now.
talent to win instead of relying on the training process.
Michael,
Yeah.
did you have
Oh,
more?
who's raising hand? I can't see everybody's hand.
Yes.
Michael,
Um,
and Christy.
Different question. So when you were discussing the block training where you try to go heavy aerobic during the second phase leading into the ovulation phase, would you do more weight training during those other phases then of their cycle to kind of manipulate their training that way? Like how would you do the other 3 weeks where you're doing less aerobic training?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the whole idea of block training is to congregate a lot of stress early in the cycle, and then the other weeks you're doing the same training but less of it. So less volume of intensity. And so it's a good way to stimulate change and adaptation by congregating a lot of stress. But to do that, you can't do 3 workouts a week every single week. So you hammer for 1 week, and then the other weeks, it's the similar type of training, but just not as much of it. So it's the same type of workouts. But with the strength training, I mean, I could talk all day about that issue, but you have to try to separate the endurance training from the strength training because there are some incompatibilities between strength training and endurance training. And so you don't want to negatively affect the endurance training at the same time by doing a lot of strength training on top of that endurance training. And you never want to sacrifice endurance training by doing more strength training because mileage is key. I mean, there's a reason why the best runners run a lot. You got to run a lot. And so you never want to sacrifice the run training because you got to squeeze in the strength training. But yes, because you're emphasized to answer your question directly, I'm the opposite of a politician. I always answer the question. Politicians are always trying to talk around the answer. I will always try to directly answer your question. So because you're hammering the endurance workouts during week 2 to take advantage of high estrogen, then yes, the other weeks, because strength training is not affected by the phases of the menstrual cycle, the other weeks, then you can spend more time and more energy on the strength training to, number one, separate the two, separate the endurance training from the strength training to reduce the incompatibility. And then also because you have more flexibility where you can place the strength workouts because it's not affected by the menstrual cycle. The anaerobic stuff, the menstrual cycle doesn't affect it, only the endurance.
Interesting, interesting. Christy, you want to be our anchor leg here?
So that was you every time you kind of lead into what I was going to ask, but let's
I
say
have
with this
ESPs, Christy. I know what you're going to ask.
within let's say a sprint world or even a jumps world, um so we're talking about the anaerobic versus aerobic system and how that's affected, but within, let's say, a 400-meter group or a 2-4 group or a jumps group where, you know would you say that it would be the same concept versus, that they would still be affected within that quality of work during that time?
No, not for the anaerobic work or skill type work. No, it's not it. This the whole issue of the menstrual cycle and the influences of progesterone and estrogen seem to only affect endurance athletes, endurance performance. So it
But
doesn't
within,
affect
like, let's say a 400-meter group where they
hmm
are still doing aerobic work, but maybe an interval format,
hmm Yeah,
you don't
there's no
think it's affected as much?
yeah, it wouldn't be because it's really just, the long endurance performance. So even for the
Okay.
endurance kind of training that a 400-meter runner would do, there's no evidence as of now that it would be affected at all by the menstrual cycle because
Okay.
it's really like I said before, the metabolic issues with estrogen affecting metabolism. That's why
Mhm.
long endurance performance is affected more than middle distance performance.
Right.
And that's why we see women do very well when they get to ultra marathons. That's where we see this really take off.
Right.
So yeah, the shorter the race that the athlete's training for, the less this whole thing is an issue.
Hmm.
Do you think there is an increased risk of injury during kind of the low times of that for those power athletes?
The low times of
Oh,
estrogen, you mean?
yeah, yeah.
Not as much, not
Okay.
as much because they're doing more. They're just not doing the volume. Most distance runners don't get injured because of the intensity. They get injured because of the volume. That micro
Mhm.
trauma for many,
Yeah.
many footsteps, hundreds of thousands of footsteps. That's what's causing a stress fracture. That's what's causing tendonitis. That's what's causing all the itises that runners get. They don't usually get injured from intensity. They usually get injured from the volume or the volume of intensity.
Yeah.
Whereas sprinters, it's very low volume. They're getting injured. When sprinters get injured, it's because of the intensity. They're getting injured from a different issue.
Yeah.
But distance runners don't usually get injured from, one intense interval workout. It's the cumulative effect of all the foot strikes on the ground. So yeah, there's
Thank
no
you.
evidence that I'm aware of that the effect of the menstrual cycle. I do know in sports like soccer, where they get a lot of knee injuries, there is evidence that the menstrual cycle phase affects like ACL injuries, but that's not usually an issue with sprinters or distance runners. They're not getting those kinds of injuries. They're getting different kinds of injuries.
And
How,
those athletes are probably still running
Yeah,
a,
sure. Yeah,
a distance. So, yeah.
yeah.
you know, well, what a
Yeah.
fascinating concept. And, this can go on back and forth quite a bit. You can see how it affects. But Jason, thank you so much for your
Oh
time
yeah, my
today.
pleasure.
Really appreciate it. And I even took 2 pages of notes. So that'll help my jumpers, right? But again, thank you so much for your time. And everybody, if you're going to NCs this next week, good luck. Hopefully, conference and regionals went well. And we will be in touch. So thanks again. Appreciate it, everybody. Have a
Thank
good
you
evening.
guys. Great to
Quick
meet you all.
question.
Yeah,
Quick
yeah.
question. Will the recording be available or no?
Yeah, I'm trying to still, now that we're into summer, maybe I'm going to be more efficient in getting them up. But I do have recordings